Then there's the threat posed by, or the threat of authoritarianism posed by non-state actors. And in the United States, it's very difficult to talk about state actors over here and non-state actors over here as though they are completely distinct entities. When you're talking about, say, corporate censorship or Silicon Valley censorship, which we're seeing rise significantly in the name of a lot of those similar threats, the idea that they're completely separate is really mythological. Obviously, many of the people who are currently in government came from those corporations. Those corporations fund both political parties. There is all kinds of constant revolving door exchanges between government and corporations. They work together cooperatively in all sorts of ways. One of the things we revealed during the Snowden report was that the NSA was working cooperatively with the 5 or 6 largest Silicon Valley tech companies, including Google and Yahoo and Facebook, to gather user data without the public having been aware of it. Corporations do employ huge numbers of former government officials or aides who now work on K Street as lobbyists, who can open doors so that they can just walk in and write legislation. So I don't want to talk about state authoritarianism and non-state authoritarianism as though they're completely distinct, because they're not, but they are two different kinds of dynamics. And non-state authoritarianism is taking place often at the prodding of state officials like politicians or regulators or people who work in state government. Oftentimes it's done at the agitation or instigation of journalists or activists. But essentially what we're obviously seeing is the internet becoming much more constricted in terms of what is permitted. And I never thought I'd be a person who would begin a sentence this way, but when I was your age, 5 years ago or 7 years ago or so, the internet was much, much different than it is now. When the internet first emerged, it was characterized by complete anonymity and complete freedom. There was no such thing as moderators telling you what you can and can't say or removing your postings. There was no ability to connect what was posted on the internet to your actual real life identity. You could use the internet to explore anything. All kinds of dissent and creativity was possible because there was no monitoring of who you were. Nothing stuck to you, who it is that you were. And there were certainly no speech codes or no commercial or corporate constraints imposed on what you could do and say over the internet. And over time, these constraints, as the internet became a more powerful tool, began strengthening. And I think one of the fascinating things that we see now in the last week with this fascinating story that I'm sure all of you have heard about, with a bunch of retail investors gathering together on Reddit anonymously on a subgroup, on a subreddit, to essentially exploit the rules of Wall Street to transfer billions of dollars from hedge funds to these individual investors perfectly legally, just exploiting their system, is the kind of thing that when we talked about the internet in 1998 and 2000, that was what excited everybody, was it would empower individuals to engage in collective action to eliminate radical power disparities between ordinary individuals on the one hand and ruling class elites on the other. And that clearly is something the internet continues to provide in terms of potential. And that's for exactly that reason, that there is now a much greater attempt to control it, to constrain it, to limit it. I found it fascinating that obviously over the last couple of years, the primary excuse for censoring people off the internet or removing them completely is this amorphous concept that they're engaged in hate speech, which we can talk about when we have the Q&A session, if you want. And then this week, a major platform, Discord, decided to, on the very day that this subreddit was starting to really scare and sabotage and undermine hedge fund billionaires, decided to ban them, not on the grounds they insisted, perish the thought that it had anything to do with this uprising against Wall Street, but instead because they found what they called hate speech on the subreddit and therefore needed to ban it. And that is increasingly becoming the tactic that these institutions of power are using. They don't care about hate speech. They don't care about civic discourse or eliminating ideas that are dangerous to marginalized people. That's not their concern in the slightest. That's their pretext for getting you to be concerned, for getting you to be scared, so that you give up this civic right that so many people have fought for so many years, which is a free and open internet. because they know that a free and open internet is one of the few instruments remaining to challenge ruling class power. And the only way they can neutralize it is if they can get you frightened enough to voluntarily hand over to them control over how it can be used, what it is that can be said, and what purposes the internet can be used for. And we are absolutely seeing that vividly in a very rapid ascent. Just very quickly before I end, I mean, if you look at the last 4 months alone or 3 months alone, for me, the three most extraordinary examples of how rapidly the censorship online is increasing is the example of Facebook and Twitter in the weeks before the election uniting to ban any discussion of reporting on the Bidens by the New York Post. They didn't take the position that it was unreliable or misguided, which isn't really their place to do anyway, but that wasn't what they did. They just censored it. They just used their algorithmic control or just brute force to prevent citizens from discussing this reporting in the weeks leading up to the election about the presidential frontrunner. After that, in the transition, they removed the president of the United States from almost every single major communications forum, which caused many world leaders who have no affection for Donald Trump, Angela Merkel in Germany, leading French officials, AMLO in Mexico, the leftist president of Mexico, to say this is extremely alarming what Silicon Valley is doing in terms of the power they're asserting to even now remove democratically elected leaders, because they're essentially positioning themselves as more powerful than nation states and as the unilateral determiners of what discourse we can engage in, of what information we can access. And then finally, 2 weeks ago, Amazon, Apple, and Google, three companies, three of the four that a House subcommittee 4 months ago said were classic monopolies, united to simply remove from the internet a social networking platform, Parler, on the grounds that people on Parler had participated in organizing the January 6th Capitol riot, when in fact there was much more planning of that event done on platforms like Facebook and even Google's own YouTube. But the framework has now been created where they can just remove an entire social media platform and have most of the public thank them for it, because the fear level is sufficiently high that people are convinced that it's being done for their own good, to give them safety that they need and crave and are otherwise lacking. So if you're somebody who cares about authoritarianism, who thinks about it, who wants to understand how it works, I think the key that you always have to go to is to use your critical faculties to ask whether or not the fear that's being cited and flagged is being described rationally or not. That's our responsibility. We all have fear as an emotional response to the world around us. And just like any other emotion, rage, anger, jealousy, we have the obligation to keep it in check, to make sure that it's not being triggered in an irrational way, in a harmful way, or allowing others to manipulate it without our knowledge.